In its Economic Survey 2014-15 tabled by the government in Parliament today, a day before the presentation of the Union Budget, the Chief Economic Advisor gave a broadly upbeat picture of the country's economy. GDP is projected to grow at between 8.1 and 8.5, inflation is expected to be in the range of 5 and 5.5, and the current account deficit is expected to be within 1% in 2015-16. To discuss the survey and try and read between the lines for possible pointers regarding the Union Budget tomorrow, we are joined by an eminent panel. Sajjid Chinoy, Asia economist JPMorgan, S Narayan, former Revenue Secretary, Dr. Arvind Virmani, head ChintanLive.org, former ED IMF and Chief Economic Advisor, Sonal Varma, ED and India economist, Nomura Financial Advisory. Sajjid, your first reaction to the findings of the economic survey, does it give you any hint of what we can hope to see tomorrow?
Well, I think the fiscal number is quite intriguing because I think the 14th Finance Commission was quite direct about the fact that you need to reach 3% in 2 years' time. If medium term is seen to be longer outside that framework, then it's possible, if you interpret this quite liberally, that next year's number may not necessarily be 3.6 and there could be some relaxation next year. I actually think this is one of those years where, despite what the GDP numbers say, the new GDP series, economic conditions on the ground appear quite depressed. So I think it's at some level less important whether the number is 3.6 or 3.9, and what's more important are the assumptions underneath that on the revenue side realistic and credible, and is that fiscal space being created to jumpstart public investment. I think investors around the world will be more focused on those kinds of questions. Of course, ideally you'd want the government to stay at 3.6 because fiscal credibility is at stake. But if we had to, for the sake of argument, go to 3.9, I'm not sure the heavens fall down as long as these two preconditions are met.
I'm so glad to hear that. Sajjid, Arvind, would you agree that the heavens are not going to fall if we reach 3.6 or 3.8, 3.9? What matters is really the credibility of the number, not just on paper what you achieve, but how good are those numbers? Are they honest numbers? And the quality of the fiscal deficit. Would you agree, Arvind? That's what matters much more than the number per se?
Well, very briefly, first on the growth numbers. I wrote on the record after the last budget that I expected a increase in GDP growth by about 1% this year, the year which is just ending, and between 0.5% and 1% for the next year, which is 15-16. So, in fact, the increase over the last year projected is 0.9% points, and the one this year is 0.6. So it's completely consistent despite the higher level. It's completely consistent with the acceleration in the economy that I expected. On the fiscal deficit, though one cannot at all disagree with the issue of an improvement in transparency, in a reduction in, how should I put it, finagling, which has become almost common. So certainly over the last many years, certainly the priority, I would agree with Sajjid, would be to make things consistent with international practice, to be more transparent, etc. But I'm still fairly confident that the government will stick to the targets that were outlined in the June budget last year, and the reason is there are lots of collateral benefits to that which we can discuss subsequently. So purely as a matter of projection, I would say there is a better than even chance that the numbers in the budget will be 3.6% and 3%.
Mr. Narayan, clearly there is no disputing that 3.6 is a good number to have. But if you have a choice between a 3.6 number on paper, but which is not an honest number, and the actual number is slightly higher, but it's papered over, and a number which is, say, closer to, say, 3.8%, but is an honest number, there is no doubt about the sanctity of the number. Which one do you think the government should choose?
I think the fiscal deficit numbers, talking about honest number and the papered over number, really the numbers come out once the accounts of the government are finalized. And as you well know, the accounts of the government get finalized over a period of 10-12 months. So really you are starting to get not the 14-15 numbers today, you are starting to get the 13-14 numbers only now. And once you get the numbers so late in the day, after 12 months or so, then it becomes I would say quite just a matter of record or just a matter of history. What is important is that is the government's estimates, how close the estimates are to the truth. And you would find that perhaps during the current year, if they are able to really come up with numbers of 4.1, and 6 months down the line when the first flash accounts come out sometime in September, October, you find that they are actually close to 4.1, you'd call that a success. And that's the way it should be really working. Especially during the current year, when there is a revision in the way in which the GDP is getting calculated, I would expect that there should be a slightly greater distortion between what the government is going to say tomorrow and what the accounts would say sometime in September, October, and what the final accounts would say sometime at this time next year, that is a year down the line. So therefore, this argument about 3.8, 3.6, etc., I would say is an argument which is I would say an opinion-based argument and not an account-based argument that will be coming up in the next few days in the media.
Sure, of course, it is an argument-based, opinion-based rather than account-based. But Sonal, tell me, how do foreign brokerages, foreign banks, etc. look at this? How important is adherence to a number, and without looking at what goes behind the number? Or is it that foreign brokerages, everybody can see through the numbers? So what you're looking for is an opportunity to clean up those numbers and then stick to integrity in the numbers. How would you view the situation?
I think, obviously there is a focus on the number because it's easy to quantify that, and everything else is more qualitative. So to some extent there is a bit of a focus on the numbers, but on the whole I think the focus is a bit more on the whole package of, the fiscal roadmap that the government sets. The key problem in India really, if you look at India as compared to other emerging markets, is not that we are spending too much, but probably that we are spending a bit inefficiently, and more importantly that revenues actually as a share of GDP are much below what it is in some of the other emerging markets. So when we are talking about fiscal consolidation, which I think is clearly important for India, because on most of the other macro parameters actually India has corrected substantially, whether it's current account or inflation. It's really our fiscal and debt which still stands out on a relative EM from a comparative perspective. So I think India needs to target fiscal consolidation, there is no doubt about it. What is more important clearly from investors' perspective is what are the sustainable strategies we are putting in place to achieve that. So what is the roadmap for subsidies? It cannot be just depending on lower oil price. It has to be some other proactive measures. What are we going to do on urea, on kerosene, some of these others? When do we move to direct benefit transfer on these subsidy items? And obviously what is our strategy in terms of increasing revenues over the course of the next 3 to 5 years? I mean, clearly there's just too much complication on the taxation side. We need exemptions to gradually go out and for the tax rates to come down. We need the GST to come in. So I think more sustainable strategy. So one, of course, is the headline number. Second is the quality of consolidation. Third is the roadmap for fiscal consolidation. Fourth is how are you backing that consolidation in terms of sustainable sources of revenue and sustainable strategies to make more efficient spending. And I think also, as we saw with the rail budget yesterday, it's not just about this year, it's about what the government wants to do in the next 5 years. So more the medium-term vision that the government presents, I think it's a whole package that will really matter more.
Absolutely, it's a long-term or a medium-term vision and the roadmap that is very important. But Mr. Narayan, Sonal talked about two things. She talked about the fiscal deficit and the debt ratios, debt to GDP ratio. But if you look at the debt to GDP ratio, in fact, India has done quite well. Not only is our debt to GDP ratio fairly okay in the mid-60s, it's also been coming down over the years. So would you think debt to GDP ratio is really an issue? We're talking about countries like the US, UK, Japan, of course, is a complete outlier with debt over 100% of GDP. So is our debt to GDP ratio really a cause for worry in a growing economy? Because even at 5%, 5.5 and now 8%, debt to GDP ratio of 60s, mid-60s is not a bad number at all, I would think. Would you agree, Mr. Narayan?
I think just one has to look beyond the numbers. Yes, in the sense that the debt to GDP ratio is coming down. You must remember that you are looking at not at real GDP in this calculation, but nominal GDP. So there's an inflation factor, the denominator changes, etc., etc. But going beyond that, Our real worry is the government borrowing actually crowding out private investments? Is it making less money, less liquidity available in the country? You see, US, Japan, etc., they are in a way borrowing internationally. The US debt is perhaps paid for by Chinese investments or whatever. But here we are much more internally focused, and the debt is picked up from within the country, and therefore to that extent the savings get diverted into government spendings rather than to private capital investment, and that is the real worry. And that is what, and you are seeing in the last couple of years that capital formation, capital investment is actually falling, has fallen from 2007, 2008 down to about 30%, is hovering just around, just under 30% currently. And this is what needs to pick up if you want the economy to grow. So debt to GDP ratio by itself 68%, yeah, perhaps it's not such a bad number, but the way in which it is crowding out private investment, I think certainly it continues to be a cause for worry. And the interest payments are also very high. If you look at the interest payments, a lot of interest payments, I mean, if you look at the fiscal deficit, almost the fiscal deficit number and the interest payment number are matching. So which means that there's a huge interest payments which are going out, and the government is continuously having to borrow just in order to pay interest, and that's not good. That's not good itself.
Survey also says that the government expects a huge surge in revenue from spectrum sale, coal block auction. Now, is this a mistake to really call this revenue? Because the government's revenue should really come from tax. The government's business is to get money from tax and to spend out of your tax revenues. Things like disinvestment can only help at the margin. And this reliance on disinvestment is actually a wrong path to go, because these are one-off items. The disinvestment is meant to bridge your deficit. It should not really be treated as revenue. So would you agree that this is a wrong way of looking at it?
I mean, from the fiscal perspective, and I think that's how most of the multilateral agencies and rating agencies look at, they remove the amount that the government receives from asset sales, precisely like you said, it's a one-off, and therefore from a fiscal deficit calculation, all of this is actually not taken into account. But in terms of is it wrong, I think clearly we are still, developing, per capita income obviously still 1500, 1600. There are huge segments of the population which still don't pay taxes. The tax penetration, in the services sector still needs to increase quite substantially. Some of the rich, farmers, for instance, still don't pay taxes. So I think the overall tax pool in the country is expected to increase over the course of the next 5 or so years, and in the meantime, therefore, using some of the asset sales to again rightly channelizing the spending, not back into subsidies and populism, but if you can use that for what they want to do, which is kickstart public investment and infrastructure, then as a one-off and as an intermediate strategy, it would probably make sense to use these proceeds, because otherwise you will end up borrowing the entire thing, because there's only so much your tax revenues can grow as compared to your investment needs. So I think from a fiscal perspective, I think one can have a debate. From a longer term perspective, you need more tax revenue collections over a period of time, but I think as an intermediate step where you don't want to substantially crowd out private sector, using asset sales for the right kind of investments actually may be okay actually.
Sajjid, Sonal talked about using disinvestment proceeds for the right kind of investment. In fact, this was the entire idea behind the National Investment Fund. But surprisingly, in fact, the 14th Finance Commission says that we need to scrap the NIF. Frankly, of course, it hasn't really taken off in any way. It was only in 1 year that any disinvestment proceeds went to the NIF. But surprisingly, the Finance Commission says scrap the NIF, put the money in the Consolidated Fund of India. Now, is that a wrong thing to do? Because once you put it in the Consolidated Fund of India, there's no way of ensuring that it goes to create productive assets.
So Mythili, let's step back because you and I have had this debate, I think, on your very channel last week. I've been talking about this asset swap idea for the last 3 months. And it's a very simple idea. I agree with Sonal, in the long run, you need tax to GDP ratio to go up. But let's think of what the imperative for the economy in the next 3 years is. We all agree that private investment is stuck in a low equilibrium. There's a lot of non-performing assets on public sector banks. It's unlikely the private sector is going to have the balance sheet strength, or banks will have the inclination to lend to build infrastructure. So let's then posit that over the next 3 years, public investment, which has gone down to 1% of GDP, needs to pick up by about 0.5% of GDP every year for the next 2-3 years. What I've been saying is this trade-off between how do you boost public investment and simultaneously reduce the deficit is a false trade-off, because I think you have to look at the government's balance sheet in a more holistic, consolidated manner. There are 4 to 5% of GDP in assets the government can potentially liquidate. These are unproductive assets the government has in some cases. And so what I've been saying for a while is have a systematic plan over the next 3 years. So this is not seen as an ad hoc one-off thing that you do every October or November or December. Have a 3-year plan to say, over the next 3 years, I plan to sell 1% of GDP in these assets, whether it's land holdings, whether it's spectrum, whether it's the holdings in Suti, whether it's reducing my stake in certain PSUs to 51%, and directly plow those resources into public investments, roads, bridges, highways, ports, because we know the private sector cannot do that. For me, that asset swap makes imminent sense the next 2-3 years, because you're moving from low productivity assets to high productivity assets. Now, whether that's done directly on the budget or it's done through a national investment fund is economically equivalent. It's from an accounting perspective may be different, but from an economic perspective it's the same thing. So I'm hoping that's the path the government goes down, because then you can do both things. You can not crowd out private investment, you can reduce the fiscal deficit, you can reduce your borrowing every year, and you're simply swapping assets on your balance sheet.
Mr. Narayan, yes, Sajjid is right. At the moment when you need to kind of push up public investment, you could use these disinvestment proceeds. But do you think in that case, it forces the government to do that if you revive the NIF, the investment fund, whereas once you put it into the Consolidated Fund of India, it's very much more difficult to make government spend on productive assets, which is why the NIF was thought of in the first place, because governments have a hand of putting their hand into the till whenever it's convenient. The Consolidated Fund of India is a very convenient till. Every government finance minister wants to put his hand into it. It's like they say about public money is like holy water. Everybody puts their hand in it, right? So does the NIF make sense? If you disinvest, put the money in a separate NIF so that government cannot under any circumstances use it for anything other than productive investment.
Actually, the way the budget making works is that there are clear heads of accounts. So if the finance minister decides even tomorrow that he is going to put away, let us say, X amount of money for the railways for investment, then he cannot draw it back and use it for other purposes unless the parliament again votes it back. So in that way he will be able to earmark funds for public investment in particular sectors if he wishes. For example, if he wants to build more ports, he can put in a lot of money into the port sector, and in that way a separate national investment fund, I would say, is less efficient than earmarking sector specific investments right up in the budget, because then it's transparent, then it's before parliament, then it can be debated, and then the decisions can be taken by the individual ministries. If you put it into the large pool like the NIS, it becomes a little bit vague where exactly the money will finally go during the course of the year. Priorities may change, whereas a budget-linked priority remains a budget-linked priority right throughout the year unless it's changed back by parliament. So yes, there is a kind of a debate both ways. But I totally agree that the disinvestment proceeds should be certainly used for fresh capital formation, fresh infrastructure building, fresh public goods, and not for ordinary revenue expenditure. There I totally agree. How you go about it, I think it's a kind of a discipline that the finance ministry needs to exercise. So I do hope that coming up in the future with substantial revenues coming in, because I have slightly another point. So the tax GDP ratio, if really the GDP numbers, the denominator is changing substantially, then the tax is not going up equally. So you'd have a situation where the tax GDP ratio actually starts looking a little more worrisome than even the last year. And therefore these proceeds from spectrum sale, from coal auction, from the disinvestment become even more important to make sure that there is room for public investment that's going to happen.
Sonal, do you share Dr. Narayan's worries on tax GDP ratio? And from what we've heard of the economic survey so far, what are your hopes and fears from tomorrow's budget?
I think this tax to GDP ratio, of course, Mr. Narayan is right, it'll suddenly look much lower. But again, I mean, that's a number. In general, we know that, manufacturing sector, the effective taxation is much higher. It's quite low for the services sector. And we definitely need to, widen the income tax, net. So those are broader issues in terms of how do you further widen the tax net in India, which clearly is one of the medium-term objectives that the government has to have in order to ensure fiscal consolidation. I think the key thing really for the budget tomorrow is, what is the economic priority of this government? And it appears that kick-starting this public investment in infrastructure is actually the key priority area. And there's been some research, by the RBI staff, which indicates that the multiplier effect of government spending is actually much more if the spending is done by states as compared to center, which is actually not surprising because states tend to be more connected, on the ground to the realities. So to that extent, the higher tax devolution that is happening to states and, giving states the flexibility to decide where they think, this money needs to go is positive. Obviously, how do you ensure, this money goes for the right purpose is a problem we will always have. But to the extent that states use the higher central tax devolution, the revenue that certain states will get from the coal auctions, then, and if this money is used for capex, actually that can have a positive effect. And there is, of course, a positive effect of central government spending as well. But, the positive spending actually happens if you spend this on non-defense capital outlay. As you know, bulk of the central government capital spending is actually on defense, and historically we've actually just imported defense equipment which has absolutely no positive benefit for the country. So I think the focus, therefore, this increased decentralization of power to states, incentive structure to get states to spend, and center spending on sort of non-defense infrastructure items. That's basically what the government we are expecting will be focusing on. And second, the idea of boosting manufacturing sector capacity in India, perhaps that is also going to see some push. So I think overall, in terms of what one is expecting from the budget, one, we are expecting them to stick to the fiscal consolidation roadmap. So we are expecting a 3.6. Second, subsidies surely coming down and capital spending as a share of GDP going up. And third, the longer term economic priorities of this government, which is, focus on select infrastructure spending. And I think one of the key things that we will be watching out tomorrow is how this money is coming. I mean, how much of this is coming from the center's balance sheet versus how much is coming from the broader non-central government balance sheet. So more of balance sheet financing of infrastructure funding, manufacturing initiatives, the low cost housing. So I think a lot more of roadmap there. And finally, I think one of the things that the budget talked about last year was the move, to a stable, more, framework on monetary policy. So we are expecting the government to essentially accept the recommendations of the Urjit Patel committee, which is 4 plus minus 2% as the medium-term target. So some of these things, is what we think could get announced.
Sajjid, the survey also seems to say there's scope for big bang reform now. I mean, I'm not very sure what exactly they mean by that, but what do you understand by big bang reform? And why is there any more scope now than there was, say, 6 months ago?
I think surveys always need to have an aspirational element. to it. So I'm sure they maybe talk about reforms to ease implementation bottlenecks on the ground. There's clearly an Indian financial code that's underway, so financial sector reforms should come. But I just think that given the near-term imperative of the budget, if we just get a sober budget tomorrow, like we got in the railway budget, we don't need grandiose headlines. I think what you need is realism on the revenue side, and you need seriousness and sobriety on the investment side, on the expenditure side, where the government makes a firm commitment to increase capital expenditures, whether it's railways, whether it's highways, or roads, or low-income housing. I think if you get details, breakdowns, and increased credibility of public investment, for which we can be convinced that the state capacity exists. I think what's important here is it's one thing to have a number in the budget, but you also need to have the conviction that the state can spend this money over the next year. Those are the only things I would look for. I mean, all these other things are 2-3 years out, and they're good for aspiration and for sentiment. But to change activity on the ground, what's imperative in this budget is to have a realistic public investment thrust, to have a timeline to reduce subsidies, and to have realism on tax revenues. As far as I'm concerned, that's what's going to affect the ground reality more than any big bang statements that kick in 2 or 3 years from now. So those would be the bare minimum that I would look for in tomorrow's budget. And I think the railway budget did an excellent job of that. It may not have had grand headlines, but the fact is there's substantial increase in planned expenditure on upgradation of existing infrastructure, and reasonable, realistic assessments on where those funds will come from. So that's what I'll be looking for in tomorrow's budget. The devil will be very much in the details.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.